In an alternate universe, this would be possible. I mean, it is, and it was, and it could be. What I'm talking about is playing Half-Life on a Mac. Half-Life has a strange relationship with the Mac on OS X and macOS. Allow me to elaborate on the history of Half-Life on the Mac, and then we'll cover at the end of this video how you can experience Half-Life natively on PowerPC and modern Macs. During the heyday of Mac gaming, popular franchises were routinely ported to the Mac, and of course, Half-Life should have been one of those titles. In April of 1999, Logicware under Sierra Studios announced the macOS version was in the works, but by October,
we're canceling Half-Life. We were about 3 weeks from shipping. The game was done.
This is Rebecca Heinemann, co-founder of Interplay, and more important to this story, the former head of Logicware, speaking on the Retro Tea Breaks podcast, discussing the ill-fated original port of Half-Life for the Mac. We will come back to this interview in just a moment. On the off chance you haven't heard of the game Half-Life, and I'm not sure why you would be watching this if you haven't, but it's one of the titans of 1990s and early 2000s video games. I know, there's better people than me to explain the merits of Half-Life, but it represented one of the key milestones in video games where the cutscenes were largely integrated into the game through scripted segments, and it also used the environment for storytelling, as well as subtle cues that enhanced immersion, and it featured fully voiced characters.
I'm afraid we'll be deviating a bit from standard analysis procedures today, Gordon.
Yes, but with good reason.
Again, this was 1998. Video game voice acting would improve quite a bit by the time Half-Life 2 was released in 2004.
Will you give your child the chance her mother never had?
How dare you even mention her?
Back to Half-Life 1, delivering the story largely within the game gave it a level of polish and thoughtfulness that was rare for the era. It even considered game pacing as it featured puzzles and breaks between the action sequences. While it wasn't the first story-driven first-person shooter or the first cinematic game, it encapsulated the best game design of 1998. The official reason why the port was cancelled, given by Gabe Newell, cited the lack of Team Fortress Classic and the lack of multiplayer with PC users, and the fear of releasing an inferior product. And this is what Rebecca Heinemann said, who previously went by Bill. I understand people can be sensitive to the subject of name changes, but we need this context for the historical reasons. Bill, now Rebecca, was quoted as saying, "The game was nearly done. Obviously, I can't release the code. Knowing full well the situation, I think they would respond mostly with annoyance." This is in regards to fans pestering Valve to release support, and of course fans rallied at sites like Demand My Mac with no success. Let's go back to Rebecca.
Apple pissed off Valve. They had a conversation with somebody at Apple, some games evangelist, who said that they would sell 500,000 copies on the Mac. So of course they said, we're not going to turn down a market like that. We'd be idiots. So let's go ahead and commission a company to go ahead and do the port. It will be get all the trimmings. It'll be a first-class version. And with that kind of income, selling 500,000 copies, no brainer, no problem. Sierra and Valve were telling those retailers, all right, let's get our pre-orders. How many copies are going to sell? And they said 50,000. And as a result, it says, for this lying to us in order to convince us to bring a game on this platform, we will never see the light of day. Half-Life, and it was then an edict within Valve, no Valve title will ever be ported to the Mac. Period.
Now, I don't want to spoil the whole interview, but this is just too good, so here's another snippet.
I want to publish it then. I'm going to publish this game. How much money do I need to buy the rights? And they said, it's not available for any price. Every single company that made Mac games went to Valve and said, look, here's a check for $100,000. Here's our advance on royalties. And they said, nothing less than $1 million. And it's like, we can't, there is no business model where giving you $1 million will make us money. And it says, it's $1 million or we don't even talk.
Oh, wow.
And so, and of course, it was really more of $1 million because we don't want it on the platform. Period.
I really recommend checking out the Retro Tea Break interview, and it'll be linked in the description and pinned in the comments, as the whole thing is pretty interesting. Some of the highlights include nearly leaking the state of the port by playing online, and Rebecca still having a copy, among other things. I should also mention that this interview is not just about Half-Life for the Mac, as Rebecca's career is pretty amazing. Rebecca was the lead programmer for Interplay, working on games such as Wasteland, Bard's Tale, Out of This World, and the macOS and 3DO ports of Wolfenstein Wolfenstein 3D. So if you take Rebecca at her word, Valve canceled Half-Life on the Mac over sales figures quoted by Apple. Interestingly, it was not the only canceled port of Half-Life, as the Sega Dreamcast would also face a similar treatment, except unlike the Mac version, it would be leaked online. The reason given for its cancellation was changing market conditions, but it had already been delayed more than once. The near-complete versions of the port featured inconsistent frame rates and long load times. It featured a sub-campaign that would be folded into future releases of Half-Life. However, Half-Life wouldn't stay away from the Macintosh platform forever, as in 2013, Valve would finally release Half-Life for the Mac. A few years later, Valve would sour on Apple. Famously, Valve originally had intended to release Proton for macOS. For those who aren't familiar with Proton, it's a compatibility layer that translates Microsoft's DirectX graphics library to Vulkan instructions, allowing Windows games to be played on Linux. It powers the Steam Deck and has ushered in a new era of Linux gaming. And Tsai has an entire video on the subject, which is also linked in the description. Apple and Valve went as far as to feature Steam VR during the WWDC 2017 keynote. Then the relationship soured again due to Apple's moving goalposts. Apple dropped both OpenGL and 32-bit support and did not adopt the Vulkan graphics API. Valve is hardly alone in this complaint, as Apple has never been able to amass a library of games due to the constant breaking changes in OS X and macOS. This is where unofficial ports for PowerPC, Intel, and Apple Silicon Macs save the day. Right now, if you want to play Half-Life natively on your Mac, you can with Zash 3D FWGS at Mac source ports. Installing isn't incredibly difficult if you have a virtual machine or Windows PC to install Half-Life on. I found this was necessary as I first needed to have a working install of Half-Life. You need to be able to grab the Valve folder out of Half-Life. And it took the Game of the Year version for some reason to work with Zash 3D. Even though I own this game legally on Steam, that's the version I had to use. Don't tell anyone, but I found it on archive.org. The next step is to download Zash 3D FWGS and install it on your Mac. Following the instructions under Mac source ports, I dragged the Valve folder from my PC to my Mac in the Library Application Support Zash 3D folder. And for some reason, I had to rename the folder to Valve. Zash 3D is a little bit rough on the edges, but this game will run pretty well under about any hardware because it's so old. Zash 3D has an OS X port that is also available on PowerPC Macs, and it runs fairly well in 10.4 Tiger on my G4 if you're willing to look past texture issues. It's actually playable. There is a caveat here. You need a OpenGL 2.0 compatible card. The game would crash when I tried to launch it with a ATI Radeon 9000, but it worked fine when I used my 9600. Zash 3D isn't the only way to experience Half-Life on the Mac. With Crossover, you can play Half-Life and it's less picky about which version you use. Using Crossover, there's less hassle. If you're running an older version of OS X on an Intel Mac, there's the pre-packaged Zash 3D port on Macintosh Garden. This version of Half-Life will not run under modern macOS. If you happen to have a Mac running 10.14 or below, you can also run the native port in Steam. As of recording this video, this is the only official port of Half-Life we've ever had. On screen is a handy chart breaking down which version of Half-Life you should download based on which Mac you want to experience it on. I didn't cover virtual machines or virtual PC because that's not really the point of this video. Depending on what virtual machine software you use, you could play back Half-Life very well. My personal pick is to use Crossover for modern Macs. For older Intel Macs running Mojave or below, you have the option of using the official port. It's unlikely we'll ever see the official port that was done by Rebecca and her team, which is sad. And also due to the relationship between Apple and Valve, I wouldn't count on Valve making any more official Half-Life ports again. In fact, on June 13th of 2024, Valve officially dropped support for several titles on the Mac. I'd like to thank my Patreon supporters for keeping this video mid-roll ad-free. If you're into retro Mac gaming, I've made a video about the cursed port of Grand Theft Auto 3 for PowerPC Macs, and one about the history of Kinetic's Virtual Game Station.